Now, installing Linux could be a daunting task, especially if you want to use Arch, by the way. But does it really have to be all that difficult? The answer is no. In this video, I'm going to show you how to install Arch Linux from scratch, and you'll wind up with something like this. A stable Linux install with all the goodies you could want. We're going to install the GNOME display manager and the GNOME desktop environment just to get you started off on your Linux journey. And at the end of this video, you're going to have an amazing GNOME desktop experience with all the goodies that you could want. So without further ado, let's get into this. I want you to be able to impress your friends by telling them you use Arch, by the way. So welcome back to Linux for Noobs, where we go from absolutely nothing to an amazing Linux install with amazing productivity benefits. We're talking a tiling window manager, a great status bar, and just overall a wonderful experience for programming in Linux. And in this episode, we're going to tackle one of the more daunting steps of actually using Linux, which is installing Linux. But along the way, I'm going to hope to maybe demystify some of these things for you so that you can confidently install Linux on your own. So first, let's go over the Linux distribution we're going to be using. Now in this video, we're going to be installing Arch Linux, and it's probably something of a controversial topic, which I'll explain in a little bit. But for me, I really like Arch Linux, and I think it suits our needs really well. And there are a few reasons why I really like it. Number one is the rolling release model. Arch has a rolling release model, meaning that every package gets updated to the latest patch, and all you have to do is run a simple command, and you can update your whole entire computer suite of packages like nothing. I love being on the latest and greatest, and I think it's a really great thing to have this rolling release model going. Another reason why I really love Arch is the Arch user repository. The AUR contains so many amazing packages, and so many great people work on updating, maintaining, and creating packages. It just gives you a great experience. You can install anything on Arch, whereas sometimes in other distributions like maybe Ubuntu, I would have a tough time finding a package. It most likely exists on the AUR. Also, the actual package manager for Arch, Pacman, is really great. It has some really nice features, which we'll explain in some later videos, but I love Pacman. Also, Arch is a very minimal distribution, meaning it doesn't give you a lot of stuff out of the box, which I think is great when you want to learn Linux. If you install a different distribution that's very popular, like let's say Ubuntu already gives you your display manager, your desktop environment, and all kinds of almost proprietary software to run all those things together. I mean, sure, you're getting a great Linux experience, but you're also getting a lot of stuff built in that you're not really sure how it works or why. With Arch, we're actually going to be able to see why these things work together and just get a better feel for Linux and how it works under the hood. Now, there are a couple of reasons why someone might not want to choose Arch if they're first learning Linux. One of the reasons I already touched on, which is it doesn't really give you a lot out of the box. So if you don't really care about understanding under the hood how Linux works, and you don't care about the processes and all the little packages and how they come together to form one cohesive system, then yeah, you could just install Ubuntu and be on your way. That'd be fine too. Honestly, that's a great idea. Another reason why Arch is kind of a tough choice is because the rolling release model, although it's great and you get the latest and greatest packages and patches and updates, it's very possible, although not common, it's possible that you could install an update to a package that breaks it. Now, this would require some extra managing of your system, but once you get comfortable with the rolling release system and updating up-to-date packages, it's not really that hard to manage. I think you'll get used to it. So without further ado, let's install Arch Linux. Now, for the purposes of teaching this course a little bit easier, we're just going to install it on a VM for now, which is VirtualBox. Otherwise, if you're installing this on a computer, obviously you would download the ISO, you would burn it onto a USB drive, and then plug that in your computer, and then boot from the USB drive and live install from there. It's a similar process, but with a USB drive instead of a VirtualBox. That's about it. Okay, so now let's actually install Arch Linux. Now, like I said, I have a VirtualBox instance here, which has the Arch Linux ISO attached to it. That's all I really got going on here. Nothing fancy. Now, when you're first greeted with the Arch Linux installation live medium, you can see we have a few choices here. And really what we want is just the regular install, which is always the first option on every single distribution out there, or at least as far as I know. So let's install Arch Linux and see how it goes. So now Arch Linux is initializing some things and just getting things ready to actually put us into a terminal where we can run some commands. Okay, now we're ready to install Arch Linux. It looks pretty straightforward, right? No? So now we're already at kind of the first stumbling block when installing Arch Linux. A lot of people don't love that we have to do everything manually here. But there's a fairly new thing for Arch Linux called the Arch install script, which actually gives you a very awesome guided installation process for Arch Linux. It's not a GUI like Ubuntu would be, but it's still pretty nice. So let's try that out. All we have to do is run Arch install from this terminal we have here. And here we go. We're in an actual installation script, which gives us some options and things we can choose from. Now, if we just take a look around here, we can see that we have some options, we can select some stuff, and we see if we try to install, we have two configurations missing, the disk configuration and a root password or a sudo user. So let's just go down each configuration option one by one and configure this installation. So my language is English, so this is fine. I can select my mirrors. A mirror is a place that the distribution is going to reach out to download things to install. Click on mirror regions, and from this I can type, as you can see at the bottom here, / to search. I am in the United States, so I am going to select United States. Now I go back. Cool. Also, in this script, we can use our arrow keys to go up and down, or Vim keys. I can do J to go down and K to go up. Pretty cool. So now let's go to our disk configuration. Now in this course, I don't want to go too deep into manual partitioning or anything like that. So let's just use a best effort default partition layout. Now dev SDA for me is the disk that we are using in our VirtualBox setup. If you were using an SSD hard drive, it would look something like NVMe / something something. So we just want to choose the thing that has the most storage because that is what we are going to start formatting and installing Linux on. So there's a couple of main options here. I'm not going to worry too much about F2FS or XFS. There are two I want to call standards in the Linux world right now. There's ext4, which is a standard in Linux for a very long time. And there is BTRFS, or BTRFS for short. Now, BTRFS is kind of a new kid on the block here, and it has some very interesting features. So let's actually talk about these really quick. Now, BTRFS has many features that give it a little bit of an edge over ext4 in terms of like file system and the philosophy of editing files and things like that. ext4 has been around for a long time. And in general, if you're trying to update a file in ext4, there's a lot more involved in this, but you're essentially rewriting data in place to update files, whereas BTRFS uses what's called the copy on write philosophy in computer science. And basically what BTRFS does is when you update a file, it will copy the file to a new space in memory, update the copy, and then update pointers that will then point to the new copy that you've just updated. Here's a quick graph that kind of explains how this works. As you see in ext4, when we update a file, you essentially overwrite the data in place. You update some metadata about what you've just updated, and then you're all done. But with BTRFS, when you update a file, you copy data to a new location, you update the data in the new copied location, and then you update some metadata that points to the new place where you just updated data. So this seems cool, I guess, but why would you care? Well, if you ever have to roll back your system, BTRFS has all those features kind of baked in. Because you're copying data whenever you overwrite it, you're not writing over the data you already had. It's very easy to just take snapshots and then go back in time whenever you want. And this is extremely helpful in Arch Linux because of that rolling release model we talked about. If you update a package that then breaks your system, you can use some features of BTRFS and Pacman to go back in time to a more stable version of your system. I find this to be extremely interesting, so I want to choose BTRFS for my system. So BTRFS chosen. And I'm just going to say yes, I want a default structure, and I want to use compression because I want the copy on write functionality. Now, I'm not going to do anything with disk encryption. I don't think it's very important for this course. If you're interested in disk encryption, you can look it up on your own. Our bootloader is Grub. There's a couple different choices here, but I've always used Grub and it just kind of works for me. The bootloader is not that interesting. As long as it works, I like it. Our host name is currently set to Arch Linux, but let's change it to something else. Now let's set up our root password. Now I'm going to choose a very secure password, and it's definitely not going to complain about this password being weak. Now we can set up another user account here, and this is the user that you would log into. So I want to set up my user account. We'll call it CPAL, and let's add another password. And this one is of course also going to be very strong and not weak at all. And then should CPAL be a super user? I'm going to say yes here because this is my user for this system, and I want to be able to modify things in the system that only super users could modify. So yes, I want CPAL to be a super user. Now this table right here is essentially output from our sudoers file. We see that CPAL is a sudo user. Great. confirm and exit. Now for audio servers, I understand that Pipewire is the newer and more preferred choice for audio servers for Arch Linux. I'm pretty sure that's the case. If you prefer Pulse Audio, that's fine too. These are just the daemons, the Matt daemons that run in the background that will handle your audio for your computer. And because this is Arch Linux, we can always change this later if we want to. No big deal. I'm going to choose Pipewire. Now kernels are an interesting thing. This is where you actually select the Linux kernel you want to use for this install. Let's look at the options. Now we see here that we have the default, which is Linux, and then we have Linux hardened, which I always picture as a Linux kernel that kind of went to jail and lived a life of crime. So it's kind of a hardened Linux kernel. Then there's the LTS Linux kernel, which stands for long-term support. I'm pretty sure. I assume that there are just less changes in this Linux kernel than the default. And then at the bottom here, we have Linux Zen, which is obviously a kernel that spent some time in a Buddhist temple and just understands how to be Zen-like. So we're going to choose the default. Now, if you have additional packages you want to make sure are installed, we can edit this here, but I don't care about that right now. Network configuration. Now for me, to sort of take away the guesswork in this option, I want to use Network Manager. You can see here it explains that this is a graphical interface in GNOME and KDE. What's GNOME and KDE? I'll tell you in a second. But we want to use a graphical interface. It just makes things a little bit easier than managing like background processes and making sure certain things start up and configuration files. I prefer a GUI for that. Our time zone is UTC. I mean, this is a virtual machine. I don't care. And then for optional repositories, again, I'm not going to add anything. We can always do this later. And now from here, we can actually just install. We've set up our configuration for our installation and we're ready to install. Arch install makes this so much easier than it used to be. Hit enter for install. It shows us all of our options and we hit enter to continue. Boom. Now it does a nice little countdown, which is always fun. And we're installing. And now we play the waiting game. And really all that's happening is we're installing our Linux kernel. We're installing all the necessary packages that Arch Linux requires and all that good stuff. So now you can always take this moment to just reflect on your life and think about how things are going. How are you doing? Good? Great. Okay, great. Now we're finished installing. So now Arch is going to ask us if we want to chroot into our newly created installation and perform any post-installation configuration. So what does this mean? Well, like I said, Arch doesn't really install a lot for us. We have our basic system components like our Linux kernel, our system services, and our network manager like we chose before, but we don't have a display manager and we don't have a desktop environment. So let me just show you a really quick outline of the Linux process and how we boot into Linux. And then I'll explain what we're going to do next with our installation. So our Linux boot process basically goes like this. We power on our Linux machine and then we hit our bootloader. Our bootloader is grub, and that's where we select essentially the kernel we want to use, yada, yada, yada. Then we load our kernel and we load our system services. This is managed by systemd, which is essentially a system services manager for Linux. It's the standard these days. Systemd will start all the relevant services that we need. And one of those services that we want it to start is our display manager. Right now, we don't have a display manager, so we want to download and install one. And then within our display manager, we can log in as our user, which we set up as cpal before. That will spawn a new user session, which will then start our desktop environment. So let's install our desktop environment and our display manager. These are the missing pieces for Arch that we need right now. So I would like to chroot into the newly created installation and perform some configuration. Our configuration is going to be installing our display manager and our desktop environment. So now I am root at Arch ISO. I am the root user of our new installation of Linux. Okay, so what do we want to do? We want to install a desktop environment and a display manager. The display manager is what the user sees and what they log into, and our desktop environment is the GUI for the user process or the user session that was just started after logging into the display manager. My favorite all-in-one desktop environment and display manager is GNOME. I love it. I think it's amazing. I mean, it kind of takes me back to when I used to use Ubuntu a lot. Ubuntu ran its own kind of version of GNOME, and I was always just used to how GNOME works. If you are a KDE fan, then check out some KDE stuff too. But I like GNOME, so I'm going to go with GNOME. So now all I have to do is install the GNOME package group. That is done using Pacman, which is our package manager for Arch Linux. We do pacman -uppercase S and we install GNOME. Now again, this is a package group, not a single package. We want to install everything just to make our lives easier. It comes with all kinds of stuff like Gnome's shell, its own like web browser, all kinds of stuff. So let's just do that. Hit enter to install all of them. And then it asks us for an emoji font. Like I'm not aware of this, but I'll just use number 1. I think that's the default. Proceed with installation. Yes. Okay, now we're installing Gnome. Gnome is going to include a desktop environment with all these packages that you see being installed right now and our display manager, which is called GDM, or GNOME Display Manager for short. Some people just don't name things very creatively, and that's fine. Okay, now GNOME is installed. What do? Well, we shut off our computer, of course. Shut down now. Oh, I guess that's not a command in chroot. It is as a normal user. Let's type exit first, and then shut down now. There we go. Now what we want to do is restart our installation and try and boot into Arch Linux. So we can scroll down to boot to existing OS. Okay, now this is our bootloader. If you remember from our previous graph, we are currently in this step right here, bootloader. This is where we select our Linux kernel. So we select Arch Linux, and hopefully we load GNOME Display Manager, but we don't. Why not? Well, typecraft login. That's our user, and our password is the password for the user. GDM did not start. Why is that the case? I'm going to guess that we never enabled the system service for GDM. So let's see how we can do that. Now again, Arch Linux uses systemd as its system manager, and within systemd, we can do things like type system or system control, and we want to enable our gdm.service. Now we want to put in our sudo password, which is our login password, and we've now enabled the GDM service. Now I'm going to try this. I don't know if it's going to work, but system you can start your services as well. When we enable GDM service, what it says is we're telling Arch Linux we want the GDM service to load on boot. So if I start gdm.service, I think, I could be wrong, but I think we will load our display manager and then we can get into GNOME. Let's see. Aha, we did it. So that's a little intro into how systemd works and how you can manage your system services as a user. So now we have our graphical interface. We can select our user, enter our password, and hit enter. This should log us into GNOME, and we should have a fairly easy to understand system now. And here we are, we're in GNOME. I want to skip my Arch Linux tour because I'm a bit of a boss with Linux. I know what I'm doing, but you can take that tour if you want. And here we are in Arch Linux running GNOME, hitting the Option key that will load up our application selector thing, and I can just type terminal to enter into our terminal. And from here, we can do what every Linux user needs to do, which is installing NeoFetch. And there you go. Now you run Linux and you can tell everyone I run Arch, by the way. So that was just an intro of how to install Arch Linux on your own with GNOME so that you can at least get started exploring Linux and trying to understand how to use it for your own. In the next videos, we're going to go over some amazing things that actually increase your productivity as a developer, I think by an order of magnitude higher. We're going to talk about tiling window managers, the difference between Xorg or Zorg and Wayland. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty of ricing our configuration, which basically means making it look beautiful. It's going to be so much fun, so stick around, subscribe, and hey, thanks nerds.